the discussion about jobs is really all about how do we attract jobs that are footloose to our community, right? And so that's the first definition we're going to have to think about. What are footloose jobs or footloose businesses? Well, a footloose business is a business that could move to my community because its customers are anywhere, right? So if I'm going to manufacture glass, I could be in any place in the country, any place in the world really, as long as I have the good quality workers that I need, and then I'm selling my product elsewhere. A non-footloose business or non-footloose job is one that depends upon the local demand for services. So a third grade teacher is a non-footloose job. So a movie theater is a non-footloose firm because you're not going to travel. We can't have an agglomeration of movie theaters. Everybody's not going to go to Butte, Montana to watch movies on the weekend, even though it's probably pretty cheap to open a store there. And so this talk is going to be about thinking about this discussion of jobs and attracting jobs in the context of what should we really be doing? What are the types of jobs we could attract to our community, and what do they mean with us? And I start this, like any good economics lecture, with an equation. It's a little distorted here, right? But the Y here on the left, this, by the way, is how economists think about growth. This is the simplest of all growth models, right? And we say that growth in an economy, or all the value of goods and services produced in a region is Y, is a function of A, right, which is technology, N, which is people, right? The alpha and the beta are really superscripts. Those are quality measures, really productivity or quality measures. And then K is capital. So in shorthand, we think that the amount of goods and services produced in a region is going to be a function of the technology that's available to that region, the number of people that are there, and modified by the quality of them in the production process, and the amount of physical capital, both private capital that's owned by businesses and public capital like this room at a university, and then modified by its productivity measure. All right, so this is, by the way, so the growth model, 1957 was this model was first proposed. And what this model really tries to describe is, if you're going to make your economy better, you can either bring more people here, more N. You could improve the quality of your people through education. That's that alpha, the Greek letter, right? That we could improve the quality of the human capital that goes into production. We could bring in more capital, that's the K, right? And by the way, we use the N in memory of John Maynard Keynes and the K in memory of Karl Marx, right? They wrote on people and capital. Or we can improve the quality of capital, that beta value. And so the business attraction that we talked about, the slides that you saw, all those political slides, were all about attracting K, bringing investment of new business to our region. Okay, so let's think about if this is a good target, if we should really be focusing on that. We would like to make our place that we live better. We would like to see the economy grow. We would like to have more job opportunities. But let's think how we get there and how much we spend on trying to get there by trying to attract K. Right? That's the big question we have. Do you want to attract people or businesses? Well, let's look back, and let's look back to the 1960s. This was when I was a boy. We have good data on it. And for the last 45 to 50 years, the United States has been a job creation machine. 90 million jobs with about 100 million more people in the last 50 years. Right? But if you look at the type of jobs we're creating and you decide which ones are really dependent upon the population, so we're not footloose, right? Which ones are highly unconcerned about who is there. In other words, they can sell their products anywhere in the world. Then we see that the United States is a net destroyer of those footloose jobs, but a huge net creator of non-footloose jobs. Right? And the same is true with income in these areas. So income, back in the Second World War, about a third of all of the dollars earned in the United States were earned by people in factories, in corporate headquarters, in logistics firms that could make their product and sell it anywhere in the world. And about 2/3 were earned by people who were stuck in place. Right? They were farmers. You can't pick up and move a farm. Right? Or they produced They were physicians, or they operated movie theaters, or they were local school teachers, people who did things that depended upon the local population. And by the way, this terribly overstates the actual amount of footloose income that's available. Think of those corporate headquarters. Are corporate headquarters going to move to Butte, Montana? Right? It's a beautiful place. It's cheap to build a big building there. Are you going to get the 600 or 700 people you need in Butte to operate your technology company? Right? So I'm calling businesses footloose simply based on where they sell their goods, when in fact almost all businesses really care an awful lot about the type of workers that they have as well. I mean, that's less important in some places. Some types of businesses don't care very much. If you're processing tomatoes, you don't need a lot of human capital and education to peel those tomatoes. But you certainly do if you've got a corporate headquarters. So only about 10% of income, maybe really 1.5% or 2% of income are really footloose in a given year. And why is this? Why could this possibly be? Well, I have a couple of reasons. The first one is this idea of capital to labor ratio. So we have a graph here, beginning in the earliest data, as did all these graphs, to the early days after the Second World War. And all of these are adjusted by inflation. If I could attract $1 million of value of capital in today's dollars back in 1947, that would have brought me 22 or 23 workers to my factory. That's how much capital the workers needed to produce the goods and services that they provided. And if you then fast forward to now, if you bring $1 million of capital in, you're going to attract 4 or 5 workers to operate that capital. So the capital labor ratio, right, the amount of investment that it takes to sustain one worker, and this is in manufacturing in a very footloose firm, is really high. And we have pictures of this. Right? This is processing tomatoes. We have tomatoes being processed in the 1920s. Right? A lot of people. The only capital there are paring knives, buckets of water, and buckets for tomatoes in a big wooden warehouse and benches. We fast forward to the 1950s. Now we have conveyor belts. We have blanching stations. We have buckets. No paring knives there. The tomatoes are being blanched and processed very quickly. And then we go to the 2000s. And this was the hard picture to find, by the way, right? It was easy to find pictures. It's the 1920s, 1950s, and the reason is I had to search for an hour to find one that had a person in it. That's one person up there in a red jacket at a tomato processing factory. So the capital labor ratio is huge. So if we attract a business to our community and it's footloose, we should expect very few jobs with it. And if you read the local papers in any country or any city in the United States, you're going to see, all kinds of flashy news on the business page about business attraction, but it's not doing much for you. But the capital labor ratio is only part of the story. This is examination of household consumption patterns from the Great Depression up until the post-Great Recession period, right? A good, long, healthy lifetime. Back in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s, up until the 1960s, half of all household income was spent on goods that were produced that you had to buy: clothing and food and automobiles and washers and dryers, things that were produced by footloose firms. By the 1960s, that changed. By the 1960s, half of the goods that we were consuming were being purchased from firms that relied on local demand for goods. So these would be services, healthcare, education, private education. I don't even throw in government in here, which is all local based, or almost all local based. Amusements, recreation, things that you buy locally. And so today, 70% of dollars that we spend are going to the production of services, not goods. And services depend on local demand, so you can't attract them to your community. They're going to come there naturally if your community is big enough, if it has the income to spend on those things. And I have a picture of this. These are 3 operating rooms, 1920s, 1950s, 2000s. Now they're not perfect because I know the tomato operations is a fairly homogeneous product. I don't know what type of surgery is being conducted here. But the lesson should be pretty clear, is that in those services, we see a growth in capital. So the available equipment in the 2000s versus the 1920s is a lot more. But so too are the people. And so I like to take a lesson from that. I have a 5th grade son. He has 26 boys in his class in a good elementary school here in Indiana. And that's the same capital to labor ratio that I had in 5th grade in 1974. Right? So the same teacher to student ratio is preserved. So in these things that we're spending our money on, right, we're spending an awful lot of money on things that are local and that we're not getting any big productivity improvements, right? And we're certainly not in healthcare and other things. And then finally, the big firms are a thing of the past. So a lot of the money that's spent to attract capital is designed to attract a big business. And this graphic shows businesses of over 150 people either relocating or being born in the United States. There are 3,100 counties in the United States and about 125 big businesses open each year. So if we're trying to track those big businesses and they just randomly flow to counties, they're not random, but close to it, then we ought to get a new big factory every 20 to 25 years. And that means that if you're looking for real growth in your economy, it's not going to come from this. Here's where it's going to come from. This is cumulative migration in the United States over the past 10 years. In thousands here. There are about 320 million Americans. That's the estimate for 2014 as we capped out the year. And what that tells us is about somewhere between 7 and 8 of all households have moved in the last decade. Right? That's not really true. I've moved 3 times. My neighbor's only moved once, but the equivalent moves over the past decade, any of the past decades right now, remain 7 or 8 out of every household. So we remain, even though we're slowing down a bit because baby boomers aren't moving as much, we remain a very mobile population. And why are people moving? Right? If we're trying to get our economy to grow, you think, well, maybe we could attract those people to our community. Most of them are going to work in jobs that are going to be homegrown. They're going to be school teachers. They're going to work in hospitals. They're going to work in the public sector as a police officer. Right? So why are people moving? And why are they selecting the places that they move to? Well, we've been asking questions about this in the American Housing Survey for about 40 years now. We ask different questions over time. Since the 1980s, we've been asking people 2 interesting questions. Why did you move from your last job or your last place? And why are you in the house that you're in now? So throughout the last 2 generations, really to the 1980s, the amount of job-related moves has remained static. And by the way, we actually had that back to the 1970s. And it was a little higher than a lot more people moved to jobs back in the early 1970s, about 20% of the population, right? As it made sense because we had a lot more locational in specific businesses, right? About maybe 20% of the population were employed in those footloose firms, so they moved around to those jobs an awful lot. That came to an end after the 81-82 recession. People moved for the last time. We move an awful lot, and most of that migration is local. So we don't see a lot of people moving because of their job, but we also ask people, why are you in the house that you're in? 70% of them because of the quality of the schools that are there. All right, so 7 out of 10 households. By the way, that's a lot more than households that actually have children moving. All right, so we not only have people moving because they want to put their children in school, but we have people moving because they're anticipating having children to move into school. Right, and so the next question might be, what are the cumulative reasons people move and where are we spending our money? So this is why do we move, right? Where are the places that, why did you move? People didn't want to own, they wanted to own, not rent. They wanted a better house or neighborhood. By the way, almost everybody reports moving to a better neighborhood, right? Things like crime, which is a public safety investment. Things like sidewalks, which is a local public good, right? Things like how good are the roads, those sorts of things. Some move to cheaper housing or for some other purpose. Some to attend college or leaving college. Change of climate, right? A lot of retirees are moving to change of climate. They wanted to move to a place where it didn't rain and freeze you to death in April, right? A few other reasons, a lot of family relations, a lot of forming families. We can assume a lot of those forming families were very worried about schools, right? New job transfer still 10 to 15%, right? Retirement, big issue here, because if you're trying to attract people, public dollars invested in many of these areas can make a difference for your region. If you had good schools, if you had better neighborhoods, if you had more safe communities, right? You could certainly do things that would attract. So let's think about where we spend our tax dollars. This is local government spending. This is my estimate for 2015 for Indiana. And I picked Indiana not just because that's where we're standing for this TED Talk, but that's also the place that has amongst the lowest business attraction spending, right? And you can see we're spending business attraction dollars here, the second biggest amount of dollars. That is in tax abatements, that is in tax increment financing, and it's direct expenditure on business attraction activities. We're spending more at the local level in Indiana on attracting that K, the big capital, than we are on police officers or firefighters or local roadways or local sidewalks, right? Community development, or all of middle schools in Indiana. Right? So it's really the second biggest expenditure that we make, and it taps out at well over $1 billion a year in a state of about 6.4 million people. And so I think this answers the question, should you be spending resources attracting businesses, or should you be spending resources doing things that attract people to move to your community? Thank you.